light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. It would seem that language is such a common phenomenon in our world that it, metaphorically, as some people would say, it becomes part of the wallpaper. It's like we don't even notice what it is anymore. And unless you take the time to think about what language involves, it becomes something that is part of every day of our lives that just goes right by without us even being able to say what the characteristics of it are. And in that notion, I'm a little bit limited because I know there are people who know as many as 10 or 12 or more different languages. I know a couple, and basically a few words in a few more, but my native language, of course, is English. Then I had 4 years of German in high school and a year and a half of French in college, and so on. But there is something that is said, and then there is something that is understood. And of course, as an autistic, I tend to use language literally. And so, because for me details are the first reality, and generalities tend to tie my brain in knots because they're confusing. And when people say, "How are you?" I can think of no less than 15 possible responses in the first half second, and I don't really know what they're asking. And half the time, the people are not asking a question at all, but what they mean by "how are you" is simply "good morning." But they didn't say good morning, they said, "How are you?" Well, in which sense? In what sense? What are the parameters? And then as you begin to study different languages, it becomes rather intriguing. I had a few weeks of ancient Greek when I was in my undergraduate years. And I transferred out of the course, not because I didn't like it, but because it just didn't seem right for me somehow. I was doing very well in it, I guess, because I seemed to have a knack for languages. But one of the interesting things I recall was that it was a language without any punctuation. And I keep thinking, so how do you do a language without punctuation? But it has to do with the ways we form understandings and the ways we transfer those understandings to another person. And not having punctuation, I mean, there have been innumerable examples of how shifting the punctuation can totally change the meaning within English language sentences. And if you put the comma here or if you put the comma there, it means two completely different things. Some of which are very embarrassing and some of which are not. In a similar sort of way, more recently with computer spell check, somebody was going through typing a paper and did not catch the fact that their spell check, that they had missed a vowel. And so instead of saying organism, they said the word orgasm. Means two totally different things. But the computer didn't catch it because it was a correctly spelled word. And it wasn't what they meant to say at all. Needless to say, it went into print and they will be embarrassed for the rest of their lives. But we try to avoid things like that by paying attention to the details. And perhaps in that sense, an autistic may be the best proofreader you ever have because, or at least in my case, because I oriented the details first. And in proofreading something, my own work or somebody else's, I don't miss a single period or comma because the details are the first reality. In any case, coming back to language, when we say things, but see, then the added problem is when you get people who deliberately don't say what they mean. They try to use a euphemism, a word that is not what it means, but it stands for it, but it's considered polite conversation, where being too blunt is considered impolite, which is why a lot of people may complain that autistic people are sometimes impolite by not respecting established linguistic boundaries. I had to laugh when I watched the movie Mozart and the Whale because there are a number of scenes in there where the autistic people are being totally blunt with each other and saying things that are so inappropriate. And it's funny in retrospect, but of course they're not seeing what the joke is because they're just being direct and serious. They want to know, so they ask a question. And but it gets very, very funny. Kind of like the person who stopped and paused and said, "Did I just ask that question out loud?" And somebody else has to tell them, "Yes, you did." And then they have to figure out how to deal with the embarrassment. But it's a question of how we use our language and how much we know languages. At one time I tried to start corresponding with someone in Russia and studying the Russian language, and I had interest in learning more, but then when I met another person who was Russian, he wasn't sure why I wanted to learn Russian. But as a language I found it fascinating because Russian does not include any of the articles that we use in English. A, an, and the, and then all the be verbs. Is, are, was, were, am, being, been. None of those exist in Russian. So how do you say what you need to say with all those words subtracted? And I guess you can do it in Russian, but you can't do it in English. But how does a translator go from one to the other? Sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's real challenging. I recall seeing a movie once where Martin Luther, it was a movie about Martin Luther attempting to tell his story. And they have a scene where they're depicting him attempting his translation of the Bible into German because he thought people should be able to read the Bible in their native language. But when he took the biblical, even being a biblical scholar, he took the words in the original text and tried to translate them into German, and there were 3 or 4 possibilities. And he had to decide which German word most represented the original word. And in what sense? Do you translate the meaning of the paragraph, or do you translate the meaning of the word, or the meaning of the sentence? It could be anything between the 3. If we understand how complicated languages are, and we bring that to our relationships, then we begin to be more forgiving, I suppose. We might be more forgiving, I should say, with someone who says things and maybe they didn't use the right words, or maybe they said something and it sounded very inflammatory, but if we stop long enough to ask them, "Did you really mean this when you said this?" they may stop and pause and look at us and say, "No, I didn't mean that at all. Where did you get that?" And they don't understand how we made our translation. Because, and when you get back to the quirks of language itself, when it comes down to it, every language is a system of symbols. There is no word that is the thing to which it refers. I can say pew, and it is a sound, it is a word, I can write it as a spelling. None of those tell you how long, what kind of wood, what color, is it made of wood at all. We could make pews out of metal if we wanted to. We could make them out of plastic if we wanted to. We could make them out of anything. But it's a word, and so language by its nature is a system of symbols where everything stands for something it is not. And when we realize that we're always one step away from the thing itself, that we're attempting to talk about something, but we really can't say or be or do the thing that we're talking about. It's a symbolic interaction. To communicate is impossible without symbols. We have to have written symbols, spoken symbols, auditory symbols, hand gestures, any number of things. They're symbols for that to which they refer. If we understand all of that, as I said in one of my early episodes, it is more reasonable to expect to be misunderstood than to expect to be understood. And if you are expecting to be misunderstood, then your next step is to correct whatever was misunderstood within the previous sentence, instead of careening forward into an argument because you assumed that the other person understood what you said, when what you thought the person understood is not what the person understood. They had an understanding, it just wasn't the one you intended. if we don't take the time to love and value the other person enough to confirm that they heard what we intended to say, problems are going to follow. Arguments are going to follow. Conflict is going to follow. The problem with all of that is that before any of that, you have to love the other person enough to value how they're understanding what you said. You have to love them enough to want to clarify your own understanding instead of expecting them to keep up with you. That would be the mental illness of narcissism. And if you are trying to get something from them and then you use their lack of understanding against them, that becomes the mental illness of narcissism, because you are not concerned for their welfare anymore. You're only concerned for what you want and for the power that you control. And somewhere in every resolution, you will find some element of love. Some shred of love for the other person, some piece of love for the collaboration that you might be able to have if they understand you correctly. Some sharing of resources, perhaps, that to understand what it is they need, and then like Debbie Reynolds in the movie The Unsinkable Molly Brown, to say to the banker, "Here, you take some, we've got plenty." And of course the banker glares at her and she has no idea why. She thought she was being generous and said a nice thing. But the banker looks at her in an angry sort of way, and she couldn't figure out what she said that would possibly make him angry, because she was understanding and interpreting the words that she used in a very different way than he was. When all of this further comes to the realm of spirituality, then we really have our work cut out for us, because spirituality is often about describing the undescribable, giving words to something that cannot be contained by words. I may choose words to wish for you to understand what I've experienced, but ultimately you can't have my experience, you can only have your own. And your experience is not going to be identical to mine. And the ways that you understand and apply some piece of sacred text is not going to be the same way that I understand and apply them, because my understanding is very much drawn from my experience, from my needs, from what I need the text to say, and from what I have understood the text to say in the past. Am I trying to validate my own life by the text? Sometimes, and sometimes I don't realize that I am. And sometimes I'm experiencing my life so immediately that I'm standing too close and I don't realize that I feel a need in my life that may already be tentatively met if only everyone else understood what the need was. The more that I am not understood, the more my needs are not met, and the more misunderstandings follow. I guess the bottom line that it keeps coming back to is that you have to begin by listening, and you have to begin by learning someone else's language. There was a pair of autistic parents that I met many years ago who were pleasantly surprised, I guess, to be able to talk with someone who had a college-level vocabulary who was in fact autistic. And they mentioned that they had a young child who was autistic. And, is there anything I could tell them that would help them be better parents? And I said, well, the first thing you have to understand is that your child already has a language. Your child already has values and words and symbols and ways of associating things and ways of responding to things. But like an anthropologist coming to a new culture, you don't know the language. You don't know what the values are. You don't know why your child is behaving the way he or she, and you don't know where to go from here, how to respond effectively. If you're expecting your child to conform to your world, it's going to take a while. If you are trying to conform yourself to your child's world, everyone else is not going to understand you. Somehow you have to learn how to be bilingual in relational dynamics with your child, so that when your child reaches for something green, you know that green is a good color and blue is a bad color. And that if you paint something blue, your child will avoid it because your child sees that as a bad color. It may not be a bad color to you, but it's a bad color to them. And so since you are trying to direct their behavior, you try to speak in their language so that they will understand what it is that you want them to do. Expecting things to be the same, expecting language to be the same, expecting words and symbols and associations to be the same, always sets us up for disappointment, because the other person is attempting to communicate in his or her own language. They are trying to make you understand, and they may not have taken the time to understand why you don't. They may not have taken the time to learn your language. They may not have taken the time to learn your values and your systems. And expecting either one to come all the way across puts a burden on the person doing the work that it leaves things always being mistranslated, and it leaves misunderstandings, and it leaves people trying to deal with the fact that they haven't been understood and they haven't been heard, and maybe the other person is too tired to listen. Maybe they are projecting their own language and not understanding how different your perspectives are. So I try to encourage them to, like an anthropologist, spend time with your child first of all, but notice how your child expresses things, what they mean when they say this, when they mean when they say that. And it may be a question of saying, you remember what you did with that object yesterday? I want you to do the same thing with this object today. Remember when you said this and acted this way? I want you to do the same thing, but with this change. And because they have something familiar to associate, it makes the translation easier. When I started studying French, the word fenêtre, for window, made perfect sense because in German it's Fenster. And the two were close enough to each other that I was using my knowledge of German to learn French, because the words were closer than if I went between Fenster and window. I could go from Fenster to fenêtre, and that I could see the correlation between Fenster, fenêtre, and window. I couldn't see the correlation. I don't know how they got from one to the other. I'm be willing to bet, though, that someone who has studied languages would be able to tell you how it got from one to the other. And then, of course, we have Romance languages and Germanic languages and various branches in the family tree of languages, I guess you could say. The thing to remember when addressing someone whose language you don't know is that we're still human beings. There is still some basis for love and attraction and working together. So there are commonalities to be discovered, but they may not be what you think. And so a lot of learning anyone else's language is being willing to step outside of your own. In order to learn the language of their autistic child, the parents had to accept that to an autistic child, this color may not look the same, and this word may not look the same, and a coat or a chair or a bed may not look the same. And the way they see it is simply the way they see it. It's not that it's good or bad or right or wrong. It's just the way they see it. And so as much as you have to deal with the way they see it, they are going to have to learn to deal with the way you see it. And somewhere in the middle is where the translation happens. It was interesting to me, jumping a little bit afield here for the second. the first time I got to travel internationally, and I found myself in a country where everybody spoke the other language, and to me it was a foreign language, and it was not, and I had to struggle for everything, and it every word was a struggle, every understanding was a struggle, and yet I was able to get things done. I was able to make things work. It was very tiring, so after a week of that, I needed to go home and rest because it was all I could do. As an autistic person, I sometimes tell people that I'm all peopled out for the day, meaning that every sight, every sound, every sensation is something my brain has to process. And when I'm interacting with another person, everything that person says or does is something I have to think about and process. And when they say, "How are you?" I have heard them, but I'm not answering because in my mind I'm going, compared to this, no, compared to this, no, compared to this, no, compared to this, yes. And then I finally know what it is that they wanted, what question it is I'm really supposed to answer. Language happens in the head, in a sense, in that when I was taking German in high school, the teacher said that you never really know a language until you stop translating your head and just think in that language. The goofy thing about that for me that happened between my third and fourth year of German. My fourth year of German, I was thinking in German, speaking in German, and it was wonderful, except that when I tried to speak in English, I would forget and use German word orders with English words, and it would make me sound very confused to everybody that I'd grown up with, and they'd wonder why I suddenly couldn't talk in the usual way. In a similar sort of way, when I was talking with anyone in German, up to that point, they would have to wait and leave a long pause before I answered, because I would have to translate the whole sentence in my head before I could figure out what it was I was supposed to say in German in order to offer a response. And so there's this added step inside the head. As an autistic, I do that all the time because everything is detail-oriented. And so vague terms tie my brain in knots, but if someone is really, really specific, I don't have to spend as much time translating. In a similar sort of way, when I came to the subject of spirituality, I had to educate people, I guess you'd say, that it was like trying to translate inside my head, that when somebody said this liturgical expression, that I would translate it in my head and it would equate to this within the systems of spirituality with which I was raised. And if I knew that we were all talking about God, we were just talking in different ways, and then I asked what qualities he was assigning to this, and they would tell me, and I might figure out that we're listing the same qualities. So for those purposes, I could say, I think we're talking about the same God. I think we're having a theology that is compatible. We're not coming at each other as adversaries, trying to decide who lives and who dies, and what the definition of right and wrong is. To understand that there are many different ways of being right and many different ways of being wrong. And that with each of these ways, what is imperative is not that they're the same, but that each person live and act and speak with integrity. If I, as a gay man, if I see a handsome man and I don't know whether he's gay or not, I simply, I have to assume that because gay men are only 10% of the population, that this man is probably straight, is probably heterosexual, and so consequently I extend this as a compliment and nothing more until such time, if any, that he identifies himself as being a gay man. So I might say, "You're very handsome," and I leave it as a compliment. I don't express it as any sort of invitation, because I'm not trying to go on a date with this person. I'm simply trying to give him a compliment, and that's all there is to it. I choose not to have impure thoughts about men who are not gay, because to do so would be to invite them to use language and do interrelationship in a way that lacked integrity. And so when I see someone and he's handsome and I say, you're a very handsome person, I leave it as a compliment, nothing more. In my head, I also say, may all your relationships be blessed, whatever their description. Because I don't know whether this person might be bi, might be straight, might be gay, might be what I call, no offense intended, a closet case. Someone who is gay, but because of his specific life circumstances, does not want the rest of the world to know that he is gay. Because it might cost him his children, it might cost him his job, it might cost him all sorts of things. And so for him the cost may be high, and so he chooses to remain closeted. As kind of akin to the idea of skeletons in the closet, or putting a coat in a closet, or something like that. That it's something you don't want everyone to know. And you have good reasons for that, or you have specific reasons for that. What bothers me more, I think, is a lot of people who don't even give any thought to why they believe or say or don't say or act as they do. To the extent that you're using language to keep people apart instead of bringing people together, that you're using language to create confusion rather than understanding, it leaves the world a very fractured place. And it leaves a lot of the very wonderful things that could be done undone. It leaves them undone. Language. It's one of the most common things, and yet one of the most misunderstood things there is. Thank you very much for watching.